In the past, some historians considered the medieval period a dark age, where very little learning took place. But many historians today say that wasn't really true. You had a number of important sort of flourishings of academic achievement, including during the reign of Charlemagne or the Carolingian Renaissance. But particularly in the late Middle Ages, you saw some changes to learning that paved the way for education and future learning in Europe. One change was writing in the vernacular. Vernacular is a term that just means one native spoken language. So if you're in Italy, your vernacular is Italian. If you're in England, it's English, etc. Through most of the Middle Ages, if people wrote, they did so in Latin. Latin was the language of educated people, and it was the language of the church. But you started to see more and more documents published in people's native spoken tongues as we move into the high or late Middle Ages. One of those was Dante Alighieri. Alighieri was an Italian writer, and he wrote an epic poem called The Divine Comedy. It was really a three-piece poem that took the journey of a guy who woke up one day and found himself in hell. And he was taken through hell by one of the ancient Greek writers, and eventually through purgatory and finally to heaven. And so it was sort of an allegory of medieval life, and it was also really critical of a lot of people. For example, as Alighieri's moving through hell, he unites all these people and all their sins and the punishments. Well, he included in hell, for example, one of the popes at the time. In fact, it was the pope who was ruling during Alighieri's life. So it sort of shows a criticism of some parts of medieval society. In England, you had Geoffrey Chaucer. Chaucer wrote a book called Canterbury Tales. The Canterbury Tales is really sort of a compilation. The setting is a group of pilgrims are on their way to the city of Canterbury to make this religious pilgrimage. And along the way, they tell stories to each other. Most of the stories really sort of poked fun at medieval society, at classes, and some of the religious and social life. So increasingly, you're going to see people writing in their own native spoken language as opposed to Latin, and it being treated as literature as opposed to, just sort of common writings. You also saw changes in higher education. Now, remember that earlier in the Middle Ages, most of the time, if you read or wrote, you were probably a priest or a monk. They were the only ones who were really educated. As towns grew and there were more opportunities and investment in things, so people didn't have to work on farms all the time, and with the growth of the middle class, you saw more people wanting to have the ability to read. And so you saw sort of this growth of professional schools, of universities. Monasteries and other religious institutions started to open the doors not only to clergy, but build separate buildings to train non-priests in important rhetoric at the time. The main sort of humanities that we think of, public speaking, literature, history, they go back to the growth of these medieval universities. You also have a particular school of thought in Europe developed called scholasticism. This goes back really actually to ancient Greece. Remember that a lot of the Greco-Roman writings were lost to people in the Middle Ages, but they were preserved by those Arab writers in the Islamic world. After the Crusades and after more trade opened up to the East, more and more of these texts are coming back, and European scholars were surprised to find the writings of Plato and Aristotle pretty well preserved in the Arab world. And they incorporated some of those ideas into their own thinking. Now, religion was still sort of the chief arbiter, I guess you would say, of thought in the Middle Ages. So scholasticism really applied logic and reason to faith. It tried to sort of logically and reasonably explain why the Catholic Church was correct in its teachings. One of the most important scholastics was Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas wrote a treatise called Summa Theologicae, or the Summary of Theology, which really sort of step-by-step took every argument he could think of against the religious teachings of the church and refuted them using logic. So while we tend to think of sort of religion and reason as being contradictory, in the High Middle Ages, they really brought together through scholastic